Yeah,
we
that's
hear you.
better. It's clearer.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Why don't we
Saturday
do?
comfort lean.
Well, I was gonna say, why don't we do our introduction? I don't think anybody else seems to be
Yeah.
joining.
Yeah.
But it might be fun. It might be one of our sort of older style where we
This
talk
is
more to each
OG
other
style.
than at the screen.
Okay.
Hi, welcome to History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. Today we're going to be talking about Ukraine. This is the 8th or 9th in our series on the Russo-Ukrainian War. And we've been covering this since February 24th, 2022, when the war started. And we've taken a break for about 5 months to let the situation change. As Aaron's going to tell us, the situation hasn't changed that drastically yet, but we have a lot of stats and statistics and other ideas about where the war might go. And so we invite you to comment, put your questions in the chat, raise your hand if you want to speak. And if you want to join our meetup and be involved in more events, there are numerous other groups numerous other types of talks that we host, like Middle Eastern history, famous women in history, Asian philosophy, so forth and so on. Please join our meetup and you can find out all about those events. If you want to see those on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel anyway, because we're just that awesome. But if you want to see some of our other events, that's the YouTube link. And we always appreciate donations because it costs money for premium Zoom, premium meetup, and premium YouTube. So the PayPal donations are at the link at the bottom. All right, Aaron, why don't you update us?
Yeah, I didn't update the date here, which is actually great because it proves sort of the limits of how much change. But I want to give some of the credits. So very little of the material that's here is directly sourced by me on the battlefield. It comes from all kinds of great people and who've made a part-time or near full-time occupation of putting all this together. So next slide, if you don't mind. So what I did is sort of break this out. We can take it anywhere we want, which is basically how did we get here? Russian and Ukrainian forces, the January to June diplomatic events, sort of the Allied support of Ukraine, Bahkmut, which deserves its own, kind of bullet, even though it's the equivalent of sort of Toledo. But the Russians decided to make war at Stalingrad level in Toledo, and then the forever counteroffensive, which is sort of my whole principle of where we really are. And however many of these you want to do or don't do, we can just rip. So if you go to the next slide, I did a couple of quick summaries for everybody, which I got this stuff from Michael Kaufman, who's fantastic. Everyone, all these people are available on basically YouTube or podcasts, or regular internet, websites. So, we're getting a greater degree of understanding of sort of Russian intentions of the original phase of the war. And what we have to recognize is, just because this isn't called World War I or World War II, we still study and debate causal, multi-causal events in those wars. We're 15 months, 18 months into this. We're going to do the same thing here for probably a generation or two or more. So, to really simplify it, the initial campaign was scoped by the Russians as a regime change operation. They assumed an easy victory. They had extremely poor preparation, and they actually maintained very solid operational security, but there's a trade-off because you don't tell anybody. And so if you don't tell anybody, you can't prepare really well because you don't know what you're preparing for. And it was emphasis on speed. There was absolutely no planning for something you'd even call a war, much less prolonged. And obviously the initial strike was a failure. And there was no, and the real key outside of all these other variables is there was just no unity of command, mass, or center of gravity that they were going after. They had 20 of them, maybe 50, who knows.
Right.
Um,
So I guess from a tactical perspective, why would they go for like what is that 20 different offensive lines as opposed
well,
to 3 or 4 directed at Kiev and maybe 1 or 2 elsewhere to draw the
sure.
Ukrainian military away?
Well, just like most of us either do or have worked in corporate environments, you have 20 or 40 vice presidents with P&Ls and business unit head responsibility. Well, the Russians, and I'm not making fun of this, they really, in some ways, have a version of that in how they were organized. I mean, that's changing, obviously, but it's something that goes back to old Soviet defensive doctrine and how they were organized in military districts and how army group corps and armies were organized separately. So everyone got a little taste at the buffet. And also, obviously, they assumed an easy victory. So these were all going to work, you know,
I think that
obviously.
the
Go ahead.
last one, I think the last one is a very important factor. They didn't expect much resistance, and they really wanted to shock, paralyze everyone. Then, when they attack on all many fronts, they expected that Ukrainian army would be completely paralyzed, wouldn't know what to do, and
That's right.
uh,
I mean, they would basically disintegrate. They assume that whatever Ukrainian defensive uh, posture that exists would have just disintegrated on given the scale, scope, breadth, depth of all these strikes coming from all these different directions. It was a video game assumption, which obviously was incorrect. So,
A quick
okay.
question after that. One of the things that I don't think that it's discussed very often, I'm curious to sort of hear your take on this. Russia and Finland had, after World War II, an agreement that Russia would control the Finnish security policy, but Finland would be able to internally have its own democracy and its own voting and political parties, many of them that were anti-Russian or anti-communist, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was so embracing and so externalizing of the revolution, even post World War II. So why did the Russians not perceive that a Finlandization of Ukraine was a possibility, let's say even during the Yanukovych years or earlier, before they've sort of committed to this track of actual direct regime change?
I mean, I think there's two simple answers. One is they did not respect the enemy or what they perceive as their enemy. They did not give them the sort of we'll call it the professional dignity of capability, and didn't have the sort of clear eyes. And I want to be clear. I can't assume from top to bottom every lieutenant up to colonel general or general in the Russian army thought this, right? I'm sure there were, just like almost in any circumstances, swaths of especially mid-level leaders who thought this campaign was absurd and insane, but it almost never matters. They get dragged along. But overall, at a state policy level, at a senior leadership level, across everything that is the Russian power base or power vertical, as it's called, just in some ways, by legitimizing the Ukrainians as a potent threat that you'd have to take seriously, well, then that starts to legitimize Ukrainians, right? It's so, part and parcel of the dehumanization and delegitimization of Ukraine is to not respect the Ukrainians for having any modernity or capability to evolve, which obviously they've proven at scale probably as capable of an evolution for a large scale force since, I would safely say since the Vietnamese, both in fighting the United States and then after they took a little halftime break, fighting the Chinese for about 11, 12 years, which I think, two superpowers or near hyperpowers needed to both lose matches against the Vietnamese, where they both felt very similar. If you did a psychometric analysis of the power verticals in each of the the countries, the U.S. and China and Russia, and you would see very similar probably behaviors towards the threat and the enemy. And so this isn't new. It feels new because everything feels new in the modern world because we have so much information. So we feel everybody should be up to date with more practical and logical decision making. But that's not true, right? I mean, you still get a lot of bad decisions every day in our lives, and small little micro ways to macro ways. This is no different. And the Russians are, which I think that's changed. Obviously, there's been a command leadership, a consolidation. They don't have 30, 50 commands or whatever. They're down to maybe 2 to 4. They've gotten down quite far. It's still probably not consolidated enough though. And that's still going to be a Russian problem. And I think some of this is just doctrinal, right, and cultural.
Can I add
Yep, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say that first of all, Russians, even after 2014, they maintain a very significant intelligence system within Ukraine. And the problem was that it didn't get to the higher level the way it should, because they gave Putin what he wanted here, this kind of distaste for Ukraine, disrespect. But the truth is that they did have a lot of information and a lot of points of influence. And up until last election of Zelensky, the Poroshenko was an oligarch, and there was a lot of oligarchic connection between Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs that they could put a lot of pressure. So they felt they had a lot of influence and a lot of points. And when Zelensky came to power, they just simply misjudged him. He's a novice. Nobody has no experience, and he is a Jew, and all this stuff.
He's a comic.
I think that
He's a TV guy, all
Yeah.
that stuff. Yeah.
That's a great point.
I mean, that's a fantastic point. I mean, because it's estimated, and who knows what the real number is, that there were 500 or so GRU agents, or let's say proxies in Ukraine. That number is probably not off by much. I'm sure the Ukrainians rolled up, 98% of them, or 100, as my friend would say, 105% of them. And so, I'm sure within that there were reports, as Greg is pointing out, that were pretty clear that, hey, math is math, right? Density, physics, of forces is real. You can tell a more professionalized force from one that isn't. And I'm sure there were reports, but as Greg pointed out, they didn't get back. Just like you've seen in large powers do these things. I mean, this is usually what large powers do to construct failed long wars. And so, and you also had a lot of competition between GRU, what do you call it, VR, and we'll call it the sort of the power command clique, and then all those individual regional commands. So, they've all had their own version of intelligence, which goes back obviously to Soviet and, a political and military culture. So I think none of those force a reconciliation in their leadership to say, hey, we're getting a whole bunch of weird signals here. Let's take time out and consolidate this. They just pressed the gas. If you go to the next slide real quick here. So this is a really easy slide to read. Sorry, but it just, I wanted to put out there sort of this balance of power on one side and sort of a whole big summary glance on the right, which, kind of, anyone that has a chance on YouTube can, zoom in on this at a later date. But this is sort of the going in position that they both had into the conflict. And I just wanted to put that up there so everyone who doesn't have this type of information at least has that as a reference point. So it's really more reference information.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just looking at this, why is it that Ukraine has significantly more long-range artillery than does Russia? Because everything else, it makes perfect sense why Russia would have more. It's a larger country, it has a more established military, all these different kinds of things.
Well, so a couple of things
we have to remember is that Ukraine was a critical part of the of the old Soviet military defense industrial base, and so they really were, and you could argue still are, a very advanced, especially anything associated with rocket, avionics, a jet. So which a jet engine on a plane, on a fighter, and a jet engine on a bomber, a jet engine on a civilian aviation, or a jet engine on a rocket booster, are a lot closer than people understand. And so they maintained both as part of the 91 treaty, and then their existing legacy assets they had. And then as an exporter, the last 30 years, this pretty decent base, especially compared to any other states in the world in relative terms, of long range, most of it legacy artillery. So it's not the latest generation, the last 25 or so years of Russian or late Soviet long range fires. But still, it was pretty substantial. And more importantly, and I think this is what really matters, is because of that, they have a very strong culture around it. So as the West has armed them with long range fires, HIMLARS and other MRLS systems, they're not having to teach the Ukrainians. If anything, the Ukrainians are saying, give me the source code so I can then do my Jedi magic with it. And these converted IT hardcore programmers that are now part of the industrial base of Ukraine, that basically hack into, positively hack, white hat, hack into these systems so that they can optimize them and squeeze every benefit out of them. So that's a huge advantage actually that the Ukrainians have. And then sitting in a defensive posture, it also helped consolidate all of your unity of command for obvious reasons. So they can cut through a lot of the management friction, which I think they've done at a pretty remarkable level. Now, what I would say is most of this hardware listed here, the last 15, 16 months, not most of it, I'd say most of the best of this hardware that's here has already been used and either used, lost, or abused. And so now, and we'll talk about that as we go on, but now we're in this very attritional phase of this war, which is really going to be a couple of boxers, sitting in a forever 9th, 10th, 11th round, and who has enough, or what does enough even mean? So next slide, if you don't mind. Yeah. So this is just as of a few days ago. And this comes from the Institute of Study of War. So, we've if we're sort of objective about the maneuvering that the Russians have been attempting to do for the last year, is really consolidate a whole bunch of defensive axes. I mean, that's really what it's been, and attempt to marginally take control of other of localized geography within Donetsk and Kharkiv where they can, from an oblast perspective, and Luhansk. And that's it, really. I mean, that's what the Russians have done. And the thing to recognize that the Russians have expended, the estimate is 10 million artillery shells doing this. So at this pace, it would take them, 400 years and 500 billion artillery shells or something absurd, which obviously is not going to happen. But the point is that this approach that the Russians have taken, which we can discuss later in more detail, is really this throw up your arms when it comes to sort of modern, what I would say is intelligent, strategic maneuver, force protection strategies, which is generally the approach that a lot of modern states have taken for obvious reasons, to more of an old school kind of attritional throw bodies, cannon fodder approach. And whether the cannon fodder is criminals or what they call criminals or prisoners or, third-party proxies or, contractors, you name it. But that really is not a scalable strategy unless they plan on imprisoning, another few 100,000 people per year, and then forcing them out into these sort of private military contractors. Next slide. Jennifer had a question about the link. And I don't think
I was gonna say, Jennifer, you haven't missed the first part of the presentation. You basically came in maybe 20 minutes after we started.
So like 15%, 10%. But you'll see it on YouTube too. So.
I think she might have meant the previous sessions.
Sure. I can put that link in the chat box in a bit. I actually want to ask, while it's on the map, you can see the Belgorod Oblast. Can you talk a little bit more about the Belgorod strike, or what happened there? How does this fit into the rules of engagement that the United States and Ukraine have set?
So, I mean,
number one, there's no invasion of Russia that's going to occur by Ukraine, because to do that, you'd have to go through all the red stuff, and the Ukrainians can't just go through all the red stuff, just like Russia can't go through all the white stuff, right? So, I'm minimizing it or making light of it, but it's sort of the whole point is that there's going to be, well, let's put it this way. The Ukrainians, I think, since last fall, have reached a consensus, which is a proportional response approach to this long-range fires campaign that the Russians have attacked broader Ukraine with, especially the cities and urban areas. And because Russia has basically spent 6 to 9 months, about 9 months, I would say, firing probably around 70% of their long-range fires, which are very expensive and take a very long time to replace. The 70% they fired would probably take 10 years or more, 15 years to replace. And they've shifted to actually a very Western strategy, which is to take traditional gravity bombs and then kind of fit them with, we call them JDAMs, but fit them with a kit, which is, fins and some marginal guidance, and then just sort of smart planning around the physical locations that they drop them from. Smart's a strong word, but I think you know what I mean. It's that a more effective approach. And then they've been launching these as sort of wave attack. And these gravity bombs, when they're launched from, 25 to 50,000 feet, can go quite far. They can go 100 kilometers, up to 100 kilometers, and they just throw dozens of these a day, in many cases up to 100, at random Ukrainian targets, sometimes intelligently toward logistics and critical targets, but more often than not, it's sort of an area bombing, a micro area bombing campaign. And well, the Ukrainians, and the reason I bring all that up is Ukrainians have basically sat on the sidelines for, I'd say, the first 6 to 9 months of that, at least 6 months of that, and didn't respond, and they were hamstrung by the West, because we believed in this instantaneous vertical escalation to full-blown nuclear war if a if a small target was hit in any Russian territory, which of course that's not the case. And so what they've done is ramped up, I would say, very conservatively in their proportional response. So, I would say there's, for every 100 targets, probably 500 targets that the Russians hit that are non-military targets, the Ukrainians respond with some attack on a generally speaking, on a Russian military target inside Russia. And they tend to be through drones, small unit attack, some sort of jerry-rigged missile, long-range fire attacks. That's pretty much been their approach. Some sabotage, etc. I would say it's pretty marginal. I think it pumps the gas on the news cycle. But if I asked you, last October, tell me about those critical attacks that the Ukrainians had in Russia, you couldn't name any of those. I mean, no one else could. So in the end, this is just inside baseball, really. It doesn't make, I think the only place they can make a difference is when the Ukrainians properly target, meaning effectively target, a critical part of their Russian logistics. If it's around ammo, or if it's around fuel,
Or the destruction of the Kerch Strait Bridge. Things like that.
Yeah. Which
there's only so many of those bridges, so those kind of targets. And that was such a 1 in 1,000. I guarantee you run that simulation 100 times, it doesn't work probably 80 times, right? So that was such a unique operation that is not likely to, maybe it's repeated one more time in the whole length of the next few years of the war. So the more practical approach is they're going to just when the Russians make a mistake, and you have a depot that has a whole bunch of consolidated material because there was some storm or some logistics planning failure, and instead of all of it being distributed, it was consolidated for a few extra days or a few extra weeks, then the Ukrainians will hit it. And I'm sure there's substantial support from Western intelligence, satellite and other intelligence forms, signals, electric, etc., that are being leveraged. And then the Ukrainians make target selection, and away they go. And then they have their own human intelligence that they have operating. So, but I don't see. The only reason this is significant is if the Ukrainians can hit enough targets in a place like Belgorod, and the Russians are forced, for force protection, security reasons, to put larger forces there to secure it, which then takes critical forces out of the battle space. That's, to me, the number one reason, or the number two reason, I would say. Number one reason is to hit any key logistics, but number two reason to hit these type of targets, and to mix the hitting, because if they just hit them with drones or just hit them with long range fires, but mix it with saboteurs and small units, etc., is that it will force Russians to have to change their forward action in their support of units on the front line. So the general winter update, which now is general summer, that's my joke, day 466 of the 10-day Russian special military operation.
Sounds like mission accomplished in Iraq.
Yeah, this is sliding. One advantage in the disadvantage the U.S. had was that it could actually conduct a long war and catch up, but you don't really ever catch up to the failure of your initial political decisions, like eliminating the Ba'ath Party and things like that. So once you failed those ones, you're really just catching up to only losing by 5 or 10 runs, not by losing by 50 runs. So I question if the Russians have the catch-up capacity, given their initial aims of not just regime control and taking over, let's say, the eastern third to half of Ukraine, but sort of this larger aim of forcing a NATO, transformation of the security architecture in Europe. So when you look at those three big macro aims, they're asking a lot more out of this Ukrainian operation than the U.S. was even out of the Iraqi operation. This is, I would say this is on the proximity of a large scale, more ancient 18th century conflict where you're looking to eliminate a state basically off the chessboard. So the same problems the Russians had 6 months ago are similar challenges because of how they support the war logistically, what their operational doctrine is. You don't change that stuff because you go to a conference and do PowerPoint, just like any of us that have spent time in the corporate world or any other institution. Workshop, don't change your company's strategy really. And when you think of a large scale modern military, it's 100 times more difficult. So the support that the Ukrainians are getting, I would say the key support going forward is the logistics and armaments obviously are very important, but what really matters going forward long term is the intelligence and the training that they're getting from the Western allies, so that at a certain point, I would say for small units, they're pretty much there, where they're now in a train the trainer mode. And they're going to likely be in a similar position the next year when it comes to sort of armor land warfare. And then and I would say when it comes to artillery and long range fires, they're there. And so really all that's left after that is the remaining air defense and then air superiority phase, which takes a longer period of time. But I would say in the next year to two, we should start to see them make substantial progress on that. And at that point, I mean, at a certain point, outside of they don't have a nuclear capability like France or UK, they don't have a navy. But from a land warfare standpoint, in the next 12 to 24 months, they will absolutely be the most potent, capable land fighting force in Europe, just in totality. Now they won't have all those other capabilities yet, but when it comes to the armor support they're getting now, which is 200 plus Western tanks, 200 plus ex-Soviet tanks, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles, and the objective is to construct these 9. This is the sort of recurring number that people have, but who knows? Let's say 8 to 12 armored brigades, which will be made up of, let's say, 3 to 4 armored battalions plus 3 or 4 support battalions. And each armored battalion will have roughly 3 armored companies and another 3 combat companies. So these are pretty modern Western heavy land forces. Like these brigades look like light division, basically. And so as the Ukrainians form this, they're finished forming this at some point, then in theory, this so-called counteroffensive can begin. I still question the scale of it. Because in this defensive posture, they could force the Russians to take astronomical losses. And when you go on the offensive, you start taking losses unless you have incredible maneuver and combined arms and complex operations capabilities, i.e., you try to stay away from the masses of fires that your enemy has. If you don't have that capability, well, then you run into those massive fires and you take lots of losses. I mean, this stuff goes to physics at a certain point. And I would say I would see, if you go back one more, I would see these numbers If you go back one more, I think these numbers are going to double at least, if not triple, over the next year, especially if the Ukrainians start employing them. So they're going to start losing, armor. But overall, I would see somewhere on the order, if the Ukrainians really turn this into a hot, offensive, heavy armor fight, I could see on both sides somewhere on the order of 5,000 armor pieces being used. I mean, this is cataclysmic level. You haven't seen this since World War II at this scale. And that has a limit for obvious reasons. The logistical limit is incredible. This isn't video games. So when you go through these type of heavy kinetic fights, your recovery time is likely 10, 30 times as long as the fight. So if you fought for 4 days or 7 days like this continuously, it's 6, 12, 18 weeks of recovery, both equipment, people, training, everything, right? So, you're not, I mean, this is not small unit action where your recovery typically is human recovery, which, I'm not suggesting the PTSD is not a serious thing. It is, but you're dealing with sort of the human ability to recover. This is material that is very complex and integrated. If it's not there, it's not there. If it takes you 3 months to source it, well, then that's what it takes you. So next slide real quick here. This is from the Ukrainian side. So what I've been doing in this whole war is, whatever the Ukrainians say, I sort of invert by 2, and whatever the Russians say, I invert by like 6 or 8, right? And that's my, unscientific calculus. My sense is that the Ukrainians have, well, I think until Bahkmut or whatever, phase 8 of the Bahkmut campaign for the Russians, until the last 4 or 5 months, I think their casualties were pretty close and equal to each other. Maybe the Russians had a few thousand more, maybe the Ukrainians did. But after Bahkmut, I think the casualties on the Russian side have just exploded. I mean, because they just threw a hell of a lot of human beings at an incredibly well defended, as we can see, because in a year, the Russians still haven't. I mean, have they really taken Bahkmut yet? Who knows? I mean, they clearly haven't fully taken Bahkmut, where Russian TV can be set up and commanders are walking around like it's their streets. So, if that's the standard, the Russians are nowhere near taking Bahkmut. My sense of where this fight is, for those of you that can remember, this reminds me a lot of a bigger version of it, but similar to the fight in Fallujah that the U.S. had. The U.S. had 2 fights in Fallujah in the Iraqis with the Iraqis. So the first fight was against a whole bunch of Sunni militants, and the second fight was really against ISIS 1.0, basically. So, and some more hardened Sunni militants. But the scale of those fights, this is very similar, though this is likely, several factors, more intense and longer, right? Those fights lasted for X weeks to a month. This has gone on for a year. So,
I sort of wanted to address here
Sure.
some of the questions around Ukrainian replacement, right?
Sure.
One of the things that some of the commentators on this war, and I'm curious about your opinion here, have said is that Russia is trying to re-Russify Ukraine, and originally they were going to do it through the creation of this subservient government, and therefore Ukrainians would be brought into line, and there wouldn't be such a thing in a realistic national sense as a Ukrainian. They would just be Ukrainian speaking Russians, for want of a better term.
Yep.
Clearly that option is out the window at this point, that the Ukrainian speaking Russians are just Ukrainians, and now the question is whether the Russian speaking Ukrainians are Russians in Ukraine, or they are Ukrainians who happen to speak Russian, right? From a national stance.
Yeah.
So is
I
the
think they're
Russian,
just,
Ukrainians who speak Russian now, just like you have
right,
Mexican Americans who speak Spanish, but that
Right.
doesn't mean they're Mexican nationals, right? It's
Correct.
exactly the same thing,
correct.
but with like
So-
10
so now-
times more violence, obviously.
Of course, the
100.
Russians can't acknowledge that publicly, but if that is their understanding, then all of Ukraine's domestic population becomes the enemy, regardless of whether Russia wins the war or not. Ukraine's domestic population is the enemy. So, is there a desire to remove the Ukrainian population entirely? Is there still some trying to?
I mean, I think objectively, where the Russians have control, there's a large scale ethnic cleansing campaign that, at least from European standards, reminds us of what happened in the former Yugoslavia. I think I don't think that's even likely. I think that's happened. That's already happened.
I was
That's
gonna say,
happening.
Can I
Will
also-
continue to happen.
I'd like
was-
to add to
Yeah,
this,
please.
if I may.
Sure.
I think what's happening is the Russians believe that there are a lot of refugees going into Russia. Some of them voluntarily, some of them not. But the Russians kind of believe that once that portion of the population is exposed to Russian propaganda, they do become Russified, and they become more Russian, even though they were there from Ukraine. And how much of it is true? It's definitely has an effect from some programs that I've seen. I don't know, with those Ukrainians that are complying with and getting help as a refugee inside Russia, what they really think inside, and how they're going to think if they spend, let's say, a year there, especially their children. It seems that it's working to some degree, this Russification of those refugees that went into Russia. A lot of them had no choice. And we're talking about a pretty significant amount.
Yep.
Are they still forcibly removing children to Russia for adoptions?
I'm sure.
I mean, I don't know if it's for adoptions only, but I think it's for
Yeah,
sure.
of course.
Yeah. Of
Yeah,
course.
I
Not
didn't
only
know.
children, everybody.
Everybody.
No, but my
know,
understanding was that the plan was to have children be adopted and raised as Russians too. So that
Yeah.
was part of the
Yeah.
total picture.
Of course, because Russia suffers from demographic problems, and that seems like a pretty good solution. I'm talking
Yeah, I
about,
mean, this is
OG 17th, 18th, 19th century sort of thinking on, or maybe early 20th century too, but sort of population transfers and sort of irredentist, revanchist, sort of chauvinistic, sort of population control and ethnic cleansing approaches. So I think that's ongoing. I mean, one reality though is that at a certain point, any Ukrainians or any former Ukrainians that are on the Russian side of the fight and are there since 2014 at that point are de facto not Ukrainians anymore. I mean, maybe by
Yeah.
legal standards for prosecution for treason and war crimes and so on, that's fine. But from a de facto de jure standpoint, I mean, they're treated as Russian combatants, and I think all the parties know that. And when they do prisoner transfers, because often that's what the type of prisoner transfers that occur, which there hasn't been a lot of discussion about prisoner transfers in the war. So there's a very strange, highly kinetic war between two similar but different peoples, where the incredible amount of violence that exists that's highly localized, when at times is managed at a strategic level, they can do prisoner transfers of hundreds of prisoners. And that I would say at this point, there's probably been thousands to tens of thousands. Some of it is just logistics. They don't want to maintain and feed these enemy prisoners, and they feel they don't have much battlefield value. on either side. My sense is the Ukrainians probably have a little more battlefield value on the Ukrainian side than the Russians do when they get transferred back. But you know, my sense is the Russians do a pretty good job in, you know, dehumanizing those Ukrainian prisoners. So by the time they get back, you know, maybe they're not the most fired up frontline fighters. So, you know, there is this dynamic going on, and that's going to continue. I mean, and by the way, that happened since 2014 in small numbers, but now it's scaled up. In a strange way, this fight is a lot like 2014, just extended, just scaled up 100x.
No, there was something that you said and that Zach said that, that Greg said that I wanted to seize upon together, is that you mentioned that this was sort of an echo of the revanchist irredentist wars of early imperialism, let's say late 19th century, early 20th century. And Greg pointed out that right now Russia is in a demographic decline, so is much of Eastern Europe, Ukraine included, in that situation, at least before the war. For me, there's sort of a cross purposes here, because at the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, you had a demographic boom across Europe. Yep. You had parents having, you know, 6 or 7 children. You had, for the first time in history, really, half of them actually making, more than half of them actually making out of childhood. You had populations in France, for example, that were 10 times the size of the population of Algeria. Right now, they're about equal because Algeria has caught up. They've had their own demographic boom, to give you an idea. And if you look at the populations of Europe before World War II, they look shockingly similar to the populations we have today in most of those countries.
I mean, I would argue the Western peninsula of Eurasia, maybe take a space that large, is in somewhere between neutral to slow to substantial demographic decline, and I include Turkey in there too.
But then my question here is, how can Russia, at least to itself, justify this sort of imperialist population transfer, replacement, territorial enlargement perspective when they literally don't have the bodies in their own territory to effectuate that properly in the long term?
Crazy thinking, right? Like when you don't have logic. I
don't think they are thinking in the long term right now.
No, exactly.
They're only thinking in the short term, and they don't need to justify. They just like turn this propaganda really loud. And I don't know, for those who have never been exposed to propaganda, because I have been exposed, it's really very effective. I mean, to some degree, maybe not completely, but because it's very difficult to withstand your surroundings, the fear, and also the even maybe sometimes illogical, but emotional arguments. They are the most effective when you it's emotional. Propaganda is very emotional. If you hear those guys, they're very angry. They just go and it really fires you off. I mean, even so it is very effective instrument. They can justify anything.
Well, look at how well it's working in the U.S. now. I mean, we are experiencing exactly that kind of propaganda.
But it's not the same. It's not.
No, but I'm saying a lot of Americans don't recognize that that's what's happening, and that's part of why it's effective.
But it's not on the same scale.
I would say
the same scale.
And I would say that the majority of the propaganda in the United States is not created by the state, right? If we're talking about the leftization, right? The leftization is occurring through media and through universities and so on. And the rightization, if we can call it that, is through Facebook and YouTube videos and all these things by private actors and major foundations, right? Those it's very different when it's coming from a state entity. And this is sort of my curiosity on this. From about, let's say 2003 or so until about 2021 or so, Russian propaganda was primarily, there is no true information out there. Everything is a lie. Everything is misinformation. We're going to add 5 different streams of truth into the pie, and therefore you can't tell what's really happening, so you might as well accept
I
whatever.
mean, this was classic Soviet KGB active measures. So they just pulled out the operating system, the old Windows 3.1 from back in the day, and just sort of slapped it on to
Right. No,
modern systems and just ran with it. And,
completely get where that's coming from.
Yeah.
But now, since the war in Ukraine, Russia has actually gone back to nationalistic defense of the state. And one of the things that you get with the previous sort of misinformation campaign is a lot of disillusioned or disinterested populations, right? They don't have a political opinion, they don't have a political aspiration. But now this 22 on kind of propaganda is, we are Russians, we need to stand tall, we need to fight in the trenches to save them.
So this is a very good point you bring up, which is so Russia's walking this tightrope, which they have so far after 18 or nearly 18 months, they've generated enough fighting human material to not have a mass mobilization. And they've done it through duct tape, band-aids, toothpicks, rubber bands, every way they can. And so what they've been doing is clearly trying to press the gas on the, let's say, go cheap version of mobilization, which is to become nationalistic, Great Russia, marches and squares, right? The kind of the old school techniques, most of which don't really work. I mean, they work with a tiny percentage of the population, but that tiny percentage is sort of, directly or indirectly part of the conflict in their support. I mean, they're only going to squeeze so many people out of that population, maybe if another 100,000. But in reality, if the Russians are to achieve, or at least even have the human capacity to even have the discussion to achieve what their aims need to be in a long war, the only way to do this is a mass mobilization. And the Russians, I believe, do not and won't do a mass mobilization, because that would start to threaten the regime, because then you would go through, in a strange way, sort of the Vietnamization in the United States, where you had a whole bunch of forced conscripts and then a whole bunch of elites that figured ways to get their kids out of it, or they hacked their way out of it themselves. And because that happens in almost any system, but in the modern world, that gets exacerbated 100-fold with modern outrage and social media and just modern culture. And so, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that, they don't want to announce mass mobilization, because that may create another, wave or havoc. But they do conduct, continuous mobilization. And it adds up. So it's unannounced. It's quiet. They try to avoid, but even in the big cities, they do. So
it's like micro mass mobilization. It's like
so
micro mass.
It's really increased. And as far as they, because I do have contacts in Russia and Ukraine, in Russia, for instance, the majority of population may not necessarily be very much for it. They just don't, especially in a city like Moscow, where people live much better. Moscow, even right now, is a well-functioning, high standard of living city, and fairly cheap. So people who are professionals there, and I've met with some professionals from there, they just simply don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to concentrate on their lives, on their everyday things, and enjoy what they can. I mean, obviously, there are people with high conscience, so they just can't do it. But the majority of population apparently managed to turn it off completely. And
so one really important point, though, is and that doesn't really get discussed, is that the idea that you do whether it's a micro mass mobilization or a mass one, so you do it either by drip or you do it in a whole bathtub. The issue is not just the militarized part of it, right? So let's say for every able-bodied male, and that's the other thing, is that this war, I mean, the Ukrainians have closer to 100,000 women, right around 100,000, 110,000. That is a surge capacity that the Ukrainians have, is that they could likely surge into, another 2, 3, 4, 500,000, females into their armed forces. But before we get to there, the Russians don't do that. So what the Russians have is, whenever you take every able-bodied male out of the workforce, and in some percentage of these people are supporting this larger defense industrialization, we have to replace them, right? So you are robbing Peter to pay Paul eventually. And I think one fundamental problem the Russians have, and the Ukrainians are learning, because the West and the US especially are forcing them to doctrinally, is the US especially, and the West overall, but the US especially, is a tooth to tail force. Think of the tooth as that combat arms individual or fighter pilot or whatever, and behind them is dozens of people, in some cases up to 50 or 100 people, depends on the kinetic component. And so all that support is what the modern complex operations require. The Russians are not designed like that. And so for the Russians to compete complex operation to complex operations, one of the reasons they're doing these frontal assaults is that they really just aren't constructed for complex operations. And to do that, you need this large support base, maybe not as substantial as the US has, but probably one similar to what the Ukrainians have. And right now the Ukrainians are building a non-combat arms support base that's likely 5 times what the Russians have. And what that does is that allows you to maintain sustainment, continuous operations, right? That's sort of the whole point. You don't just do it one time and then you have to start and rebuild again 6 months later, but you can re-up maybe in tranches of 3, 6, 9 weeks, until all your people and material have obviously worn down, and then you fully replace them and rotate them. But the Russians just don't have that capability. And so these micro mass mobilizations, however effective they are of sort of surging untrained people into the system, well, who's going to train them? And who's going to get them the material they need? And who's going to sustain them all the way through their initial wave of combat? It's just, the Russian system is, at the scale, is so haphazard that it really isn't very sustainable for anything more than the operations that they've conducted. That's why I think it's a long war. But yeah, so, if you look here at the momentum, if there even has been momentum, I would argue there really hasn't been much momentum in this whole conflict. I mean, if in theory you want to count defensive war having the capacity to have momentum, maybe. I mean, that's the sort of the theoretical argument. But in practical terms, neither side has been able to show that they can construct the battlefield environment and then their forces around it to then construct these advanced complex operations to build momentum. And I don't think the Russians, outside of areas they could surge into, which then they would have to defend and, likely suffer pretty substantial losses doing that. And at this point, that seems to be the approach the Russians are taking, which is, frontal assault, build defensive trenches. I mean, it's World War I, really, what it is. And there is some advanced weapons. So it's World War I, circa 1980s and 90s. That's really what the Russian tactics are at this point.
Can you explain why World War I battle tactics would be used here from a military standpoint, when World War I tactics were primarily defined by strong defensive capability,
Yeah.
poor offensive capability. But
Yeah.
we have the tank, we have drones, we
Yeah.
have air forces. These were all things that World War I did not have.
Sure,
and
but if
therefore
you
they lacked
can't
that
if you
offensive
can't
capability.
tie those together cohesively, it's like saying, and I want to use real world examples here. It's like saying there's a doctor, there's a nurse, there's a hospital administrator, there's a clinician, there's a nurse practitioner, there's a surgeon, there's a this, there's a that. Okay, how come we don't have a tier one, medical center that can take, any golden hour people and, get 98% of survivability, which is the gold standard at a Mayo or at a Cleveland Clinic or Hackensack or NYU Sloan or whatever. Well, it's like that's just some talent input, right? Or technical inputs, right? It takes all that coordination, planning, orchestration, training, simulation, professional competence. I mean, it's just all that other stuff, which isn't exciting and sexy and whatever. It's actually boring corporate drudgery that, most of us just, don't want to talk about on a Saturday afternoon. But in reality, that is the magic that allows you to tie all these pieces together. And whether it's construct a tier one, golden hour, top of the food chain medical center, or a tier one military with the ability to conduct complex maneuver operations with all these pieces of technology, it's really the same thing. And I would argue it's very similar to that example because of the incredible complexity you run into in a tier one center. The difference between a tier one and a local urgent care, it's like outside of people wearing white clothing or blue clothing, that's like the similarities end there, right? It's just it's so radical, the difference. Well, at this point, I think the Russians have scaled up the equivalent of a bunch of urgent care centers and say, oh yeah, we can fly in people who need brain surgery. It's like, that doesn't really work like that. I mean, it does, and then you'll lose 75% of your patients, right? So that's not really our standard in the modern world. So the Russians are sort of stuck with these requirements to do advanced operations, which require a doctrine, a professional training, a culture that would take realistically in non-combat environments years to construct while combat's going on. It's almost impossible. I mean, a great example of this is look how long it took for the United States in Iraq to adjust to the asymmetrical warfare that went on. You could argue it took at the low end 3 years and at the high end 6 years. And in Afghanistan, the low end 6 years, at the high end 12 years. So let's say it took the US 9 years in Afghanistan. And understand this, it took 9 years in Afghanistan after the US had already been adjusting in Iraq. So it's not like you had idiots sitting there in PowerPoint corporate meetings saying, oh, what's that data? It just was like, how do we tie these new variables together? I don't know. Well, okay, let's put a training exercise together with a whole bunch of people and let's, spend a year or two figuring out how they really do this, and sometimes you never get an answer that's clean. And so just like if you go to a tier one center and that's why my answer in life is if something's really bad, take me to the tier one center. If I can't live there, well, inshallah, right? Like you're not making it anywhere. And this is sort of the same thing, but at a military kinetic warfare invasion level. And I just don't see how the Russians will ever square this circle. I think it's impossible. I think Ukrainians at best will triage that circle. And that's probably enough for them to gain some percentage of Luhansk and Donetsk back, and they'll take some percentage of that back over time. But it's not this sort of push button clear the Russians out either. But I don't see how the Russians can conduct forward operations in any substantial manner. And I think they know that. So, these glide bombs, that's sort of what I was talking about earlier. You basically take a dumb bomb and you use physics, literally. You put fins, you put gyros on them, you kind of connect them through modern communications. You try to put a little bit of steering if you can. You get really high and you push, and that's basically what they're doing. This is not effective in any military approach, but this is their psychological warfare. The Russians are just gonna, and if you notice the last month to two, they've been randomly striking Kyiv, with 5 to 20 of these. And so you're walking down the street and, your CVS is blown up or whatever. It's like, that's basically what they're doing. Now, do I think this weakens Ukraine? No, I think this only hardens people, because you see regular civilians that you're fighting for, that, are sort of completely unfairly targeted. And more importantly, it's not like your enemy is even trying to find a military target when they're doing this. They're in some ways actually doing the opposite. They're trying to, in essence, assault the civilian population. So I think that's really where the Russians are on this. Will they get lucky? Will they put a good plan once in a while together? Sure. But on a rolling basis, sending out thousands of these, they're just going to be wounding and killing civilians 95% of the time, probably 99%. Ukraine, I think what's important for them objectively is they can't fall into this trap of having an operation that goes sideways and any Russian civilians, especially older civilians, get killed. But so the Ukrainians have to maintain discipline. And this is really hard when you see a war against your population happening. So to me, that's going to be the real test for the Ukrainians the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, no, it's a fundamental morale issue. Zach, I think you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, just wants a couple of things. I totally understand Aaron's comment, and I agree with him. There's could be a lot of parallels with United States coming into Iraq. But I just want to make a big distinction, since I'm from there, just interesting aspect. Like recently I've been watching videos from Mariupol. Obviously it's all propaganda, Russian propaganda. We're rebuilding this hospital, we've adopted 30,000 children and moved them to Russia, stuff like that. There's so many sympathizers, as hidden sympathizers with Russians in the eastern Ukraine, that it's virtually for Ukrainians to fight. It's almost like they're fighting two wars. Basically, they're fighting Russian war, and then they're fighting wars against collaborators. So in this case, there's a big divide and distinction between us coming into Iraq, where basically there's not there's more of a Shia. In this point, more like a Shia sympathizers and Iran sympathizers more than anything. And on the Sunni side, you would think about the more of rhetorics of the being more sympathizers with even Wahhabi movements and ISIS and whatnot, all of those radicals. So that's why I think that's so hard for Ukraine to even in this case to operate in this environment. That's just a comment I wanted to put in.
No, and by the way,
one thing I just wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, my analogy was.
I'm sorry. One more thing.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, one more thing is initially you guys also were talking about the the fact that a lot of media, Russian media, they call them Nazi, which means Nazi sympathizers or Nazi followers in Ukraine. And any comment I make on YouTube during any kind of I don't know if you know this spokesman Solovyov, which is a big Russian spokesman on the Russian One TV, who basically promulgates and says that they want to nuke the Western countries. he basically said, "Oh, you guys always saying that Ukraine has a Jewish, by mother president, Zelensky, but he's not Jewish by blood. I mean, he's Jewish blood, but not by ideology," which to me sounds ridiculous. I don't think Hitler made any difference whether you were Jewish by blood or if you had an ideology. For him, Jewish was Jewish. So that whole rhetoric doesn't make any sense, and that's the way that they operate. They divide. They saying, "Oh, there's Jews that hate Jews, there's Jews that, But I just think that a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the propaganda doesn't make any sense on the Russian side. Unfortunately, it's like there's zombies that they can't really change their way of life. That's just my 2 cents. Sorry.
Richard.
Can't hear you there, Richard.
I think there are really 2 points to make on this. The first goes to that latter point is I was never a major fan of the Ukrainians aren't Nazis because Zelensky is a Jew argument. I just don't think that that's a real honest response to the question. It's a very flippant response and it sort of nails it in the coffin for a lot of people. But from an argumentative perspective, it's just not accurate. If the Ukrainians are Nazis, right, it's because of certain discriminatory practices against their population. It's about this. It's about certain governmental choices. It's about the expansion of corporate power in the government and all these sorts of issues. And while there is a plutocracy, certainly in
You're muted, Richard. Richard, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, so it's basically advancing the slides instead of operating through Zoom. That's what the issue is. Okay, but it's not, to the extent that Ukraine is a plutocracy, it's a plutocracy because it was set up as an oligarchy in the post-Soviet period, not because of any institutional changes by Zelensky. And there's no discrimination, anything close to what the Nazis are doing. Like, that's the response to Zelensky, Ukraine is a Nazi country. It's like, no, they're not actually doing anything that the Nazis were doing. On the Iraq piece, I think that the collaborator issue went in the other direction. In a lot of cases, it was either on the Sunni side, Al-Qaeda, Iraq, and other similar militant groups saying, "Oh, look, these are those American collaborators," or on the Sunni side, it would be Muqtada al-Sadr and all of these kinds of Shiite clerics saying, "Oh, these are other American collaborators. They're not loyal to Iraq, or they're not loyal to Shiism, or they're not loyal to the Islamic Republic because they should be loyal somehow to the Islamic Republic." Just for clarity, Muqtada al-Sadr is against the Islamic Republic, but that would be at a point, for example, from the PMF, right? So you have these different groups, but the collaborators were seen as the pro-American ones, not the pro-Russian ones, in the sense of like Russia is the invader, so it would be,
and understand my use of the Iraq analogy was not down to the people level. It was about how large states stumble or fail at large scale war aims or optional wars. And so that was really, and what the learning processes are and how long that takes to transform their doctrine and their ability to sustain operations, and that they in general never recover. Right. It's very much like in almost anything else in life. When you design something poorly, you can't fix it in maintenance. Right. If Sony sends you a bad microwave, meaning like it's designed poorly, it doesn't cook what you want it to cook. And I'm not picking on Sony, I'm using any name.
Anybody.
Generally sending it back over and over again isn't going to fix the bad design.
And I think the Iraq-Ukraine parallel is actually a really good one, in that if you look at the neoconservatives like Fukuyama or the Arabists like Fouad Ajami, who talked about the invasion of Iraq,
or Bernard Lewis, others like that.
You're talking about people who have minority opinions in their world, right?
Yep.
Fukuyama's opinion about the end of history, which is what he believed in 2003, was not the dominant opinion in historiography. And
No.
Fuad Ajami's opinion on the Iraqis will treat us as liberators was not the dominant opinion among Arabists in the United States, even.
Yeah.
And so they seized upon these minority opinions and acted in a way that would demonstrate that to calamitous results, is exactly what
That's right.
the majority of historians would have suggested. And I think if Putin had not shot the messenger, how many times he's shot the messenger, and actually collected different opinions from across Russia, he would have gone with something like a Finlandization, or he
Yeah,
would
that's
have
right.
gone with something that is less necessarily provocative.
Yeah, and violent.
Against
Absolutely
Ukraine.
right. So if you go to the next slide, this is my sort of thesis of towards a longer war. If you go on to the next slide, and I think you've known this, Richard. I've been saying this for literally 15 plus months. I had my view is I already had a lean in view from before it even started, that if it got started, it was a long war. And then my normal calculus, which I take to any conflict that is going on, which is if it goes past 2 weeks, its ability to get to 3 to 6 months is pretty high. And if it goes to more than a month or two, its ability to get to several years is really high. And then once it gets the momentum going and the kinetic scale of 3+ months, my sense of this was 3 to 5 years, and I stick to that. I just don't see anything that's going to get in the way of that. And so, one side either has to choose to give up or lack the physical ability to continue. I mean, this is physics, right? We want to throw a whole bunch of almost modern moral calculus, which we can at the individual human level, but that has no bearing on state actors fundamentally. And one thing that's lost in this that I think is very important is that any hope of reducing the intensity and the and constructing some marginal off ramps all ended over a year ago, when it was pretty clear that when the Russians went through dozens of towns and committed thousands of atrocities that were then magnified all over the world, and more importantly within Ukraine, that there's not going to be any leader, Zelensky or not, that's going to have any political support for direct negotiation of a status quo ante of the conflict and freezing it in place. That's just not, it's just not politically viable. And it doesn't matter what people who want to end the conflict or people who think it's terrible or think people, it just doesn't matter. Like, I'm not saying they don't matter. I mean, they matter as individuals, but they're not going to have any impact. If anything, they're going to be viewed as naive, and they're going to be completely discounted because so once and I remember when that happened. And when that happened, I said, this thing's going until basically both sides or one side has enough physical ability reduced that they have to really bring the conflict intensity down so much that at that point it goes back to sort of the 2014 skirmishes, almost like line of control issues you have between India, Pakistan, China, etc., which are still kinetic. I mean, people still get hurt and killed every day, week and month and year there, but it's not a full scale, war. So my view is that there's not, neither side has the ability to construct any decisive military shift or political shift for that matter. I just don't see any of this changing. And even this sort of theoretical counteroffensive or offensive to counteroffensive, I just don't. It's one of the reasons I haven't been, cheerleading this, because I just don't believe it's very real because of the complexity required. I don't think Ukrainians have that ability yet to conduct more than maybe 50, if they're lucky, 100-kilometer level of operation, and then they had to stop for think of what they did last fall in September. We're 9 months later, and they can't conduct a full-scale offensive operation yet. I mean, that's how hard it is and how challenging it is for them.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about something that you mentioned, because there are some very important political thinkers, let's say, who've talked about the possibility of peaceful negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and advocating for that. I'm thinking at the moment of Mearsheimer, Kissinger, and Chomsky, and
hundreds of
others who have a platform who
Right.
think like that.
but
And
I
then
would,
tens of thousands of disciples of
but
theirs.
I would say, yeah, exactly. I was going to say that these are people with disciples. These are people who are listened to on this topic because they're listened to on a lot of other topics. So I just want to sort of address their perspective.
Sure.
Mearsheimer and Kissinger are coming from from the same perspective, which is a perspective that there are only really superpowers in the world, and everything else is a subordinate of those superpowers. So every country, so the United States is of course the most important and most powerful superpower in their view, but Russia is a superpower and China increasingly is a superpower. So an area that Russia claims as its backyard, its sphere of influence, is an area that should be Russian sphere of influence as part of that negotiation to avoid a much larger kinetic engagement between the United States and Russia. Now, I don't believe that a large-scale kinetic engagement between the United States and Russia is at all likely. Russia won't instigate that because they know that they would be destroyed if they did. And the United States won't instigate that because they know that the Russians have nuclear weapons. So it's, to me, it's trying to reinstate the Cold War, because that was when they understood politics more than it is the respect
100%.
for individual states and nations making their own political decisions, which is the world that we've entered since the 1990s.
That's exactly right.
If you actually read some of Mearsheimer's stuff, it was a Mearsheimer or Kissinger, I don't remember which one of the two, but in the early days of the 90s, they actually suggested re-empowering Russia to become a new Soviet Union just to restart the Cold War and prevent the creation of the European Union, because that might be a more stable outcome than an empowered Europe, because they knew what that outcome looked like. It's just a bizarre form of thinking.
No, I mean, look, when you look at it, when you look at it theoretically in an IR, there is just like religion. I'm not going to pick on one. They all have it. They all have a interesting detour at some point into a doctrinal cul-de-sac, and so there's a part of offensive realism, which very much like you said earlier, you'll have even within a more minority view, you'll have some strange adherence to some other philosophy that's way out there that doesn't get excommunicated. And some of those people have very strong platforms, and they're both on the left and the right, and some on the center, but most are in the left and the right. And well, I don't even say cleanly on the left and the right. They are often associated with the left and the right, but in some ways they're almost their own brand. And then they just sort of infiltrate different avenues. So people, because of this new flattened political world we have all over, where
anybody can say anything.
Yeah, you say anything. So right now, like within the tech intelligentsia, obviously this war is not a cool thing, because when you mix it with high interest rates, it's taken their bubble away, and that's not fun. And now they got to get real
so
jobs.
Elon Musk wants to end it.
Exactly.
I was actually going to add that, Chomsky, his entire rationale for supporting Russia is that he doesn't like the US. Right?
Exactly.
He's very imposed to American imperialism.
And then you have European versions of this, which I will say, I am.
No, it's like we understand their critique of American imperialism, such as the bombing of the Ashifat clinic in Sudan, which somehow is the most famous one that everybody likes to talk about. But like, I understand that critique of American imperialism, and I'm sympathetic to it. But that doesn't mean that other imperialisms are somehow positive by the fact that they're anti-American.
That's right.
And so I'll give you a great example of where there's a similar political shift. And I remember saying this a year ago when she came into power, but we have this determinism now on all sides of politics, that when Meloni came in Italy, and basically everyone said that it's guaranteed she's a fascist, done, that's it, right? There's no other analysis needed. And I said, well, she's going to surprise you. And in the last 2 months, she has basically thrown out, all forms of Russian support and that exist in Italian politics, and has pressed the gas far greater than the Germans and the French in supporting the Ukrainians. And she's likely, gonna pull up the stops on the Chinese and the BRI, because Italy has this sort of quasi side deal that if they don't, that if they choose not to renew it in another, I think it's November or September, I think it's September, then no more BRI in Italy and in Southern Europe. And so, it's easy to kind of look at these political leaders or these sides and just assume a determinism to them. And I just don't think in this modern politics, just like with state and imperialism of the Cold War, or the structure of the states during the Cold War, it's a much more free floating world. I'm sorry, Greg, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I remember when I was reading Chomsky in 80s, because I wanted to understand, he was such respected. I was really amazed back then, because I was fairly fresh from Soviet Union, that what he is writing about is exactly the same that's in the Soviet textbooks. I was really amazed. I didn't see that as anything original or very. Obviously, I've listened to him since. He's a really great intellectual, but yeah, he has a tendency. I kind of don't trust his rationale. I agree with Richard.
It's basically Western Leninism. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
And it hasn't evolved much either, right? It's it's not just him, right? All these people, and I think that's the bottom line. There's a whole bunch of really old, no offense to any older people here,
right,
white guys that are, basically punching out a whole bunch of their greatest hits from the 60s and 70s, and they're able to get, monetized or whatever. It's not like a lot of bands that are still around from the 60s and 70s that do these sort of reunion tours. And Ukraine war just represents a new Coachella for them to kind of run around and, get on the internet, or get broadcast time on YouTube or whatever a couple thousand times.
I also wanted to say that it is a main strategy of Putin, that he believes that Russian people are much more resilient than the rest, and that he will eventually out-survive the West.
Yep.
And there is a point to that. It may happen because of these voices we were talking about, and because of maybe a new government, maybe Donald Trump, maybe somebody else will decide to change something and decide to influence Ukraine. It seems that it's hard from the moral point of view to try to influence Ukraine. It's their fight. You can of course stop supporting it, but that would be ridiculous. But definitely this rationale is not without a point. How much patience the West, US, and Europe has to keep supplying, since this war seems to be very long and going to continue for a long time. It's hard to predict the outcome. So who knows?
Greg, your point is very well taken.
Very good
Democracies don't have long-term consistent will. That's one of the things that a lot of authoritarian regimes, especially China and Russia, point to. Now, I have a question from Zach in the chat. We get conflicting reports. Did the Russians actually take over Bahkmut? And if they did, how effective was the Wagner group in doing it? And further, are they better than Ahmad and the regular Russian forces? Or what about the Chechens? And what do you make of Prigozhin's rhetoric?
Yeah, so there's
a little Bahkmut section, so maybe if we do another one of these and another week's continuation, we could drill in. So if you want, let me just fly through this slide and the next slide. But basically, the principle here is that when people say a great Ukrainian or Russian victory, what they really mean is some small operational achievement. But there's no guarantee that you can build on it, that it won't take another 3 to 6 to 9 months to reinstantiate another thrust. And so, which has really been my thesis from the beginning, is that both sides both sides lack the operational capacity to conduct complex operations. Ukrainians are gaining marginal capacity, which is enough for them to launch an offensive operation, let's say realistically, every 6 to 12 months. But by that math, that would take them, 20 years to get the Russians out. And by the Russian math, it would take 400 years. So, that's, I think, where they are. If you go to the next slide real quick.
Can I comment on that question? I mean, Prigozhin, who leads the Wagner group, it's he is more effective only because he is determined. This is directly related to his political power to make any kind of victory by any cost. And he managed to achieve it. I don't know, we could argue some technicalities, but he mostly did take the Bahkmut. But then now his troops are completely exhausted. So he said, okay, fine, I just did it. I'm pulling out, let the Russian army hold it now. And that's probably going to be harder than taking it. So that's one thing. As far as the Kadyrov is concerned, that's a very, I listened to interesting broadcast by Russian in opposition journalist Maxim Kak, who is fantastic, I think. He basically saying that Kadyrov is not effective at all. He's not basically, his army is not participating. It's a small one compared to Prigozhin. Prigozhin has about 40,000 people. Kadyrov has maybe 4,000 people. They are not participating there, but they have a lot of power because they are considered to be Putin's bodyguards. Kadyrov entirely depends on Putin because he made a lot of enemies in Chechnya. All the elders are against him. So without Putin's support, he'll be gone. So he is 100% loyalty, while Rogozin power is growing, and even though he's still dependent on Putin, but it's now he becoming in some very careful ways to challenge him.
Yep. No.
Absolutely. So to finish up this little section here, and then we can dive into we have some questions earlier about political support, so I have a few slides for that, and then the rest of it is sort of Bahkmut, which either we finish up in another session or the after session if anyone's interested. So at this point, I really see the highest likelihood outcome is some mix of frozen conflict with continued Ukrainian operations, right? So in a strange way, it almost reverses the positions that they had in 2014. That, I think, is the most likely outcome. And so far, the EU or the European states, the EU member states, to be specific, have provided about a third of the support that they did in the first Gulf War, the scale of that support. So and the US. So I still think there is a substantial another third that is going to occur over the next year to year and a half, which is going to allow for that frozen continued operation to go on. And then we'll see if there's the capacity to generate that final third. But so that's how we should think about this, is that this is, and for those of you that don't know, that the Gulf War in terms of material was astronomical in size, right? I mean, you had over you had nearly 15,000 heavy armored and artillery and fire pieces on the Allied side. and obviously close to 700,000 in forces, plus a fully integrated command with several thousand airframes. So it was astronomical in terms of total size. But what's clear is that is going to be the required kind of magnitude from what the Ukrainians already had, what they can generate themselves in terms of industrial capacity, and what the West and any other allies are going to generate for them to even have the capability to eject the Russians from, I don't even know if it's all of Ukraine, but maybe. So it's going to require a size of a bread box that large. And I don't think that's really been discussed politically by people, culturally, psychologically, all the above.
So why do you think that the Persian Gulf War, which was a war that was not for a European allied state, was not on the European continent, had nothing to do with anything that would really affect Europe, because the oil that is produced in Kuwait mostly doesn't go to Europe. Most of that oil goes to East Asia. So why were the Europeans so much more willing to act in the case of the Persian Gulf War than they are in Ukraine, considering that this is the biggest military conflict on their continent?
I mean, look, I think the end of the Cold War mattered, because most people have no idea about this, but that when the UN resolutions were proposed and ultimately passed, they had Soviet/Russian support for them, which was unheard of. So you had this moment of truth where you had this disillusion or the dissolving of the former Soviet Union, this shift in politics around that, and then you had this large-scale invasion of Kuwait and the threatening of Saudi Arabia. Now, I do think, because oil prices are global, right? It's a commodity, that while the oil itself might not have been direct oil from Kuwait that was used in very much European industrial production, the impact on energy and a recession and likelihood the idea of an Iraq invasion of Saudi Arabia without any sort of unified defense would have likely been pretty catastrophic in energy markets and changed and would have likely triggered an Iran invasion, which is strange given that Saudi is a Sunni country, but it would have then shifted to the balance of power issue, right? To the idea of an Iraq that is that strong. So Europeans had, and you also had that last generation of Cold Warriors in Europe, right? So you had enough of alliance of thinking that was behind it. And then on the flip side, you had a Russification post-Soviet era of, there's no other way to put it, but in essence, of penetration operations across Europe for the last, especially 25 years, economically, politically, socially, industrial, energy, you name it. And so the European member states and their polities and their businesses and kind of their overall social culture has had to have this shock to the system, and they're having to adjust to the new reality of they can't sit there and say, well, yeah, what the Russians do over here is not good, but in the Netherlands we like that $1 trillion that's come in, or whatever, or in London property markets, or in the French in investments, or the Germans obviously with all the energy, so and the Italians and so on. So and obviously the export of all the luxury goods, tourism, real estate that has been acquired by hundreds of thousands of Russian elites, much less millions of Russians that are whatever semi-elites, let's call them upper class, Russians who travel and send their kids to school or, whatever, and tens of millions who acquire, various European goods, right? So there's been this, there's no other way to put it, but this relationship that's been developed that is in essence being broken apart now. And the Europeans are having to stumble through this, right? It's the equivalent in relationship terms of realizing that your partner was married to someone else for the last 20 years and had a whole family, and you now have to rearrange things. So you're still on mute, Richard. Sorry, I can't hear you there. Yep.
Oh, I'm not saying anything.
Oh, okay. I thought you were. So next slide real quick here. I know we're so we talked a little bit earlier about, some of the diplomatic stuff, which I just don't think there's much room in the diplomacy. It's, you could argue there's a whole bunch of parties that are going to say it's bad, war's bad, stop war, this hurts people everywhere, etc. But that's not going to shape the actors in any significant way. It might release a little extra food stocks or energy or potash or whatever, but it's not going to really structurally impact what the decision making is on either side. And I know elites all over the world are aghast that they're not listened to when they have something important to say, because they're state on state, existential violence basically and war. But that's the facts on the ground. The next slide, real quick here.
What is this vote that we're actually looking at here?
Oh yeah, so this was a UN resolution, which was a PRP, the PRC, the Chinese, wanted a vote on their 12-point peace plan approach, and that there should be a approach pushing towards peace, the theoretical do peace. And the fact that the Chinese were willing to do this, even though I think most parties believe that the Chinese are maybe not fully on the Russian side, but they're not definitely against the Russians at this point, is that, enough parties that wanted to vote for this inserted in an amendment suggesting that that this was Russian aggression against Ukraine and Georgia, and that obviously China and India abstained from their objective of building this as a new approach. And this is all diplomatic theater. I mean, none of how do you enforce this? You don't.
Sure,
right?
This is a vote that peace is better than war, yes, we all agree that peace is better than war. Now,
except for 18 abstentions and 5 against, and which two of the abstentions were 2 of the ones that were trying to write it. But that's always what's fun. But anyway, so
interesting observation here that all of those countries of former Soviet Union in Asia, only Kazakhstan votes with China,
yep,
but the 4 others vote with Russia.
That's right.
It's kind of interesting.
No, it's true. I mean, like even Cuba,
they kind of abstain.
Like even Cuba sits there and makes a business decision now and says, okay, well, our new Russia is probably, or Soviet Union is probably China. But
as far as the position in that region in particular, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, those all, actually, I don't think there is a Turkmenistan here. Oh no, Turkmenistan also. So it seems that it shows how much influence China has.
That's right.
In those, like
That's
it
right.
definitely has a overwhelming interest in Kazakhstan, and it appears probably Turkmenistan, but not.
That's right. So yeah, we talked about most of this already, all the pledges, if you don't mind to go on.
Can't believe they found the one leader in the world that Zelensky is taller than.
I know.
That,
It's kinda
that's
funny.
amazing. I didn't realize Rishi Sunak was that
Oh,
short.
he's very short, actually. So nothing against short people. I'm only 5'8", so but I'm tall compared to to but so this to me is what's fascinating is the shift, especially in Japan and South Korea, which you can't underestimate what they are as defense industrial powers. And the Japanese and the South Koreans right now are the, I would argue, preeminent conventional military hardware industrial manufacturer in the world, given the value that they generate. Their cost of quality is arguably about half, probably not much more than that, maybe 40% cost of what it is for the US, much less for the Europeans to produce similar military hardware. And they're scaling up. And Japan, obviously, for their own domestic and local security requirements, are also scaling up. And this conflict can actually support the Japanese in scaling up even in a greater degree. And the Japanese and South Koreans, the Republic of Korea, have finally seemed to be putting to bed their wasted, whatever, 7-year dispute, which is a big deal when it comes to not just Asian security, but I would say this war. Because if the Japanese and the South Koreans are pressing the gas in terms of developing a military hardware, and even if by their policy, what they're doing is, and this is sort of the game that's going on that most people I think aren't aware of, is that if even all they're doing is rearming European states, but the European states can then sell and transfer arms to the Ukrainians, which is in some ways what's going on in the United States. So most people I don't think understand that almost none of our appropriations for military hardware is to Ukraine directly. It's to the US Army or the Marine Corps. Most of it's to the US Army. And what's going on is the US Army is transferring, gobs of military hardware. And what's going on is this is a modernization exercise for the US Army. So the same way as the Europeans. So basically the Europeans and the US Army, and eventually the Marines to some degree, and Air Force-ish, will basically shove, the last 2.5 generations of their military hardware to the Ukrainians while they proportionally modernize. And so the Japanese and South Koreans will be a big deal to that. Next slide. And the Germans seem to be finally getting in gear, which, by modern German standards is a year to 2 later. But, don't underestimate that the Germans have their own version of what the Japanese are going to go through, and that they're going to modernize also. They have, and with their industrial capacity, that's going to be a big deal. I mean, if you have the Germans, the South Koreans, and the Japanese, that are also helping generate a huge industrial capacity, while the US is, and Australia, French, and Italy, and the smaller, and Netherlands and UKR. I mean, that is an arsenal of the world, very much like World War II. That's going to both modernize all of these states, which is also what Russia and the PRC are not excited about. But also is going to provide Ukraine with an enormous amount, like it's going to turn Ukraine into an arms depot, basically, for the next generation. Next slide here.
Well, I mean, we're at the 2-hour
Yep.
mark, so I think
Yeah.
that this is probably where we should stop. If we have some questions, perhaps we should take those. But
Yep. Yeah, we can take questions, and then if you want, we can do another session to go over Bahkmut and some of the political support and other slides I have if you want to, or we can wait another 3 to 6 months. It's up to you.
Well, Aaron, since you have them already prepared, why can't we do it in a couple of weeks if you want to do it?
We
For
Totally do it in a couple weeks if you want to.
I'm so intrigued by.
Yeah,
I mean,
just not next Saturday because the Champions League final. So don't do it then.
Oh, Champions League final. Who are you rooting for? Inter? Just joking.
Yeah, well, Man City won the FA Cup today, and so they're likely going to win next week. But
Did Howell score? I didn't look at it. Shit.
yeah. So, anyways, let's yeah. So we're game to do this in a couple of weeks if you want to, and we can drill in if you want to take some questions now. Hopefully, this was good. I mean, I think one thing about this conflict that's challenging for people is that as it recedes to background radiation, no pun intended, it feels a lot like the Yugoslavian conflict or how Iraq, by year 5 or whatever, is that these things just sort of sit back and they're just running. And I argue that's basically what this conflict is. The big difference is that the large states are taking it seriously, like at their political leadership level. And I do not think there will be, and I think this might be a little more controversial, but if you look at how the U.S. is budgeting for this, which is to rearm our existing service branches by transferring existing hardware, I don't see anything that stops that could even get in the way of that until really the back half of 2025, because the way budgeting works, right? You're going to get the 25 fiscal year budget by October in 24, so before the election. So that's going to, that'll take you all the way to the back end of 25, which at this point is, 30 months from now. So by that point, you'll have so much German, Japanese, South Korean, existing European, and U.S. Armaments developed that, I don't see anything that gets in the way of this support for Ukraine that way. And to me, the budgetary support is what counts. I know everyone wants the political support and they want the polls, but when push comes to shove, it's about the budget. It always is about the budget. And I don't.
Aaron, I have a question. I mean, it bogs me with Prigozhin coming out and challenging the security forces, the Russian Reyes forces, challenging Putin. Is he trying to be next president? Is it his?
I don't know. I mean, I think he just had. A lot of people in the modern world do a lot of hot mic takes, and I think he's definitely a provocateur. If you do look at the Bahkmut, there's a map there. Yeah. No, go back. Yeah, no, right there. Back to December. The one that said back to December. Yep. So since December, we did this in January, the Russians have moved 4.16 kilometers. So they move about a kilometer a month through Bahkmut. So, I mean, that's the fact on the ground. I actually haven't really seen anybody sort of talk about this like this. This is Michael Kaufman. So, or actually, no. This is Perun. Yeah, this is Perun from Australia. And, but that's what the Russians have accomplished. So when we say the Russians have accomplished this, the Russian army was in Bahkmut for 6-ish months. And then the Wagner group started to combine with the Russian army for about another 6 months. And then the Russian army in some ways pulled back, and the Wagner group did human wave sort of assaults for about 3 months. And they're all the way up to 4.16 kilometers.
So basically like a tractor trailer in Los Angeles.
Yeah, no, literally. I mean, literally, that's what we're talking about here. I mean, this is the movement that we have to square everything. So when we talk about this, any of these concepts as a place, right? The word of the place or the geography, it's like you need a map like this. I always look at a map first to see how big is the bread box? How big are we talking about? And when you look at what Bahkmut is, right? I mean, Bahkmut is smaller than Toledo. I mean, like not now, obviously the place is the size, it's like a a park in upstate New York in terms of how many people live there now. But I mean, it's in terms of pre-war, Bahkmut was, a city of 70,000 people, right? It's not a large city. Arguably barely a city. It's right on the edge of what you call, a small city. So this is as far as the Russians. I mean, so ultimately, this is this question of what's the value here, and I argue there was value here maybe a year ago in principle, when you look at where Bahkmut is on the map, but at this point, this has absolutely no value because when you can construct so many defensive positions, because that's what the Ukrainians have. I mean, the reason the reason the Russians can only go this far on these arrows is because the rest of these are these 5-10 layer entrenched positions, all with intersecting fire, mortar, artillery, long range fires, you name it. And it's just another, and actually in a certain way, I think the Russians with their human wave tactics sort of had an advantage inside the city area because structures give you degrees of cover when you do human wave assaults. I mean, you still can get a bunch of your people killed, but when you go out to these fields, I mean, this stuff doesn't work. I mean, literally, it doesn't work, right? It's like watering ants. So, I mean, I don't really know what the gain is here fundamentally. I mean, except for Wagner having this, this sort of we are greater than the army sort of branding exercise, which, and remember who's in Wagner, basically, these sort of suicide pact criminals who were given this deal, ever-changing deal, that if you can live 6 months, you get out, you're free. And now what I don't know, and I never saw this, is your record expunged? I don't know if it is, because if you still get out early, but you still have a record, well, then that's going to block you from, because there's a lot of most things in Russia are blocked for people who have what we call sort of violent felony criminal records. Like they can't get a bunch of government services, all kinds of jobs. So I wonder how much of a get out of jail free card it really is. But that was the majority of the people in Wagner. And then they have a hardcore cadre of maybe 5,000, which are their professional contractors, but somewhat expendable. If you guys remember the Syrian Russian support and the US striking, I think it was about 250 to 600 Wagnerians. Sounds like an opera. Sorry. And I've been waiting for that one for like a year or two. But I mean, that's what Wagner is. So now, can Wagner repeat this 50 times? No. Are there any other PMCs that can scale like Wagner? No. So, I don't know what the Russians do with this, because now, remember, I mean, these are now their positions. They own them now. So guess what they have to do? They've got to put forces in there to defend it. They got to build their trench lines, their intersecting fires, their mortar and artillery, which, I don't know if that's just another plan to get more Russians killed at this point. I don't think the Russians have these deep plans, to be very honest. I think this is all opportunistic, like Greg was saying the last hour.
Aaron, what does on the floor action look like? How many losses are like daily, weekly, monthly? Is there some statistic?
I mean, there's these raw sort of who knows stats. I mean, that are obviously more than one and less than 1,000 a day. That's pretty guaranteed. So, I think realistic statistics are, and to me, deaths are less important. I mean, not they're important. I don't mean to make it sound that way, but they're less important than overall combat casualties, because combat casualties you have to take care of, or you have to do something with them, and they also over time make units combat ineffective. And so I think it's pretty realistic to assume, given the wave attacks and the scale of wave attacks that the Wagnerians did and Russian forces prior to that, that the losses were definitely, in terms of casualties, in the hundreds a day on probably both sides. I'd probably say, on the defender side is likely to be a little lower, but still pretty high, right? Because remember, for the Russians to only get this much territory, that means the Ukrainians have had to reinforce. Well, the reason you have to reinforce is you taking a hell of a lot of contact. And if you're taking a lot of contact, I don't care who you are, right? It's not Skynet, right? You're not T-1000s, right? You're going to take casualties. So I would say they're both consistently, in the hundreds a day in casualties. I think that's pretty safe to say. Yeah.
I actually read that usually in this kind of type of urban combat, the advancing side usually lose like 4 or 5 times more than defending side. I don't know how.
Yeah, I mean, yes-ish. I mean, I think in an area like this that's so dense, and it's buttressed with open fields, which means you can have longer lines of logistics. I think if you're in a large city, the thing that, I mean, use the word kills you, but it's sort of true, is that your logistics have to run through the urban terrain, and that slows your logistics and lines of support down. So once they're out of this, let's say realistically, 1,000 square block, which probably not even that much, probably 500 square blocks, and assume 250 on each side, or are safely on each other side. So you're really contesting no more than a couple hundred square blocks. Your lines are actually reasonably supportive, so that you can marshal resources, people, material, to your front, and you can also entrench your firing position for mortars, artillery, smaller artillery. Actually, that's a big advantage when you're fighting in this kind of terrain, this kind of picture. You can actually bring in smaller artillery, like 105 millimeter, 90 millimeter, etc., which can be absolutely devastating in these kind of environments. So, and also recognize that when you're losing and gaining, you're both on the offensive and defensive on a consistent basis. That's why I kind of treat it as a wash on both sides. I mean, maybe the Russians lost twice as many, probably because the Wagnerians were not very well trained or led or supported. So that's probably fair. But in the end, the Russians had more to lose. So I think in the end, I think, is this a win for Ukraine? Yeah, I call it a light win, because the Russians, they definitely depleted Wagner. I don't see how Wagner can take on a large scale operation like this until they're completely re-upped. I also think that something that hasn't been talked about a lot is, we talked about this last year, is that, the Russian conscript rotation process, the contracting, which is a September, the major one is in September, the minor one tends to be in March, April. And so all the readings on this is that the March, April one is down quite a bit. So I think a big test for Russia in September is going to be their conscript cycle. How many, because their promise they've had is that they're not going to send conscripts or people labeled as conscripts, so in that first year, to fight. Well, what it seems like they're doing is trying to sign them up for a second-year contract, and that's when they can go and fight. But the sign-up rate, I think, has been consistently maybe no more than 20 to 30% for that second year. And so this will be interesting to see, because now you're going to have a new conscript cycle of new conscripts and a second year contract rate. I don't think the Russians can break that promise right now very effectively, because it falls into what we were talking about earlier. It's not a micro mobilization anymore, right? If you're bringing new conscripts into the fight, I mean, tell me the difference between them and Wagner, really, at that point.
I was going to say, can you talk a little bit about how you think, or you don't think that the Ramzan Kadyrov and the Chechens are going to change the calculus on this?
No, not at all. I mean, look, these guys operate effectively in these mostly in these Middle Eastern sort of asymmetrical fighting environments. Where you can, it's almost like it's warlord fighting is what it is. It's gangs, warlords. You have these area protection rackets, basically, with lots of small arms.
And they're small.
Yes, they're
altogether.
small.
It's about 3,000-4,000. That's all. And
maybe they juiced it to 10,000 with a bunch of other losers, but you're never getting up to big numbers that you need. And it's just another pile of poorly led, poorly trained, poorly material resourced, which, like I would argue if all the Russians produced is half a dozen of these groups, like they have a coordination problem now, because like all they're doing is generating more complexity.
They're not, from my understanding, actively participating or making any difference in this combat at all. And as far as Wagnerians are concerned, they're depleted. They're going to recover. But Prigozhin made a point. That was the idea. And,
That's right.
He doesn't need to make it again in the near future. Maybe at some
that's
point.
A great point.
So
that's a
he doesn't need to actively participate. He now wants to kind of reconstitute and enforce his fighting force just for his benefit, political benefit.
That's right.
Yeah. So
and what he's building, I mean, this is what will be interesting, is that what he's building is a loyal cadre. And we all know the history of loyal cadres.
They're loyal to him.
They're loyal to him, especially those 5,000, those real hardcore 5,000 cadres.
Right.
They're
and
officers.
He's very
and
careful with spending those. He's spending the new recruits, but those they're like in the back, and they're so
Well, I heard a great line, which was a telegram line, which was so most people who are in prison have a time date, right? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever, except if they're in prison for murder or things like that, and they're there for decades, 20, 40, the rest of their lives. Well, the line was, I can trade a known, which is 7 more years, 5 more years, which is horrible. Russian prisons are awful. It's a brutality. I mean, it's just horrific. For this, it's not Russian roulette, because my chance of dying out there is not 1 in 6, 1 in 8, 1 in, like a standard revolver. It's more like 1 in 3. So I have a 3-shot revolver I can play Russian roulette with for the next 6 months of my life. And that is sort of, and they say it in a Russian, and you'll know how to say this, Greg, but they say what I just said in like a Russian, phrase, poetic phrase. And that's basically, and I think the jig is up on that one too, right? All those sort of initial wave people who signed up for Wagner. Well, you're in a prison now, and people are like, what happened to Jimmy? He's not Jimmy, obviously, but Ivan 1, Ivan 2, Ivan 3, Ivan 4. Oh, the Ivans are all gone. It's like, it's like pretty soon.
But those who survive, they become heroes. Not only that everything is like a clean slate, but they also heroes, and they become political figures.
Well, they become really gangsters
right now.
They become gangsters, is what they become.
But some of them get elected in the smaller towns.
That's true. Good point. That's a good point.
They get some political force.
So it's definitely a ticket, like out of, if you survive your 1 in 3 Russian roulette, it's definitely a ticket out of loserdom into, some new stratospheric life relative to what your life was. I think that's the bet. And I think for a certain,
that's the propaganda is for. They don't talk about those who die. They talk about, like, look at this guy. He served his term, And look where he is right now.
Yeah.
He is completely like he's a new citizen. All right, everything is forgotten.
Well, and you
he's
know
a
what? You bring
hero.
up a very good point, which is if there's a time to join Wagner, it's right now, actually. So, because as they rotate out,
Right,
they're going to have this reconstitution period for 6 months. My guess is they'll try to cherry pick some other operations, you know, that are much smaller than Bahkmut, and that'll be it. So this is probably for any of you that have any friends or family that are stuck in Russian prisons and want to get out, you know, 5-10 years early. I was saving that one. Sorry, I knew I'd make Greg laugh on that one. This is the time to join Wagner. But no, taking it seriously, I think this was a big band-aid, and they're now basically, you know, gone. And now it's back to the Russian forces, which is where we were 6 months ago. And now I do think the Russian forces are more organized, have less unity of command problems, but they still don't have the training. And don't underestimate the enormous cadre they lost of trained, capable people last year. And that's a generational loss. I mean, you can't replace those people. So, you know, that's where we really are. So there's your Bahkmut question, Zach, if that's good enough. And I know this is usually your cut-in, Richard, for.
Excellent. But you know, like Stalin used to say, the mothers will always bury more children. That's a Russian gimmick all the time. Not those kind of children, but still.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we should definitely do. This is like never-ending, you know.
No, absolutely.
Topic.
Yep. And then we can talk about all these other slides I have next time, and you know, and I can add some more.
So I guess, yeah, I'll close this out. Please find us on our website. If I could find a slide, I would. But apparently it's only in the other direction. So
yeah, the other direction. Sorry.
So all right. Bye.
You know, by the way, Richard, I love how we went OG from like 2 years ago. This was kind of fun. I miss the old days. The less professional.
It does have a very different feeling than you know, lecturing to 40 people and you know the complete and total silence as seems to not participate. All right. So we are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. We do stuff on Ukraine, Middle East, powerful women, dead languages, dead powerful women languays. You know, we try to mix it up.
Yep.
So
get your uncles out of Russian jail and joining Wagner.
Exactly.
That reminds me.
By the way, we do not recommend that. No self-radicalization.
No, I know. I was going to say that as a discourse. That was a joke.
If you are interested in being part of our Zoom community and seeing these lectures before they happen, knowing when they're going to happen, you can join our meetup group. It's right there in the description. If you are part of a meetup group that is otherwise, you may see some of our events, but not necessarily all of them. We would love for you to subscribe to our YouTube page. Our YouTube page is in the link, and you can see any of the episodes that we've done, not just today's 8th episode in the Ukraine War series, but all the other Ukraine War episodes and the episodes from our other series, like my favorite MENA series, Aaron's European Union History series, and all the other series I just mentioned. And of course, we have Zoom, YouTube, and Meetup. All those are premium, and we would appreciate if you helped us keep the lights on if you enjoy what you see. Of course, it'll always be free. Our channel is not designed to rake in the big bucks, but if you like what we do, please help us out.
Thank you, Richard. I just wanted to remind tomorrow also Jane is doing the Artemisia. So do join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. It would be, be really interesting. It's a powerful women series. And then we'll have plenty of other ones, like we'll have acceptance of knighthood. We'll talk about Templars. There's going to be a person that, his name is Jonathan, is going to present a lot of the interesting ancient weaponry. So, I mean, not authentic, but it will show you what knighthood was used particularly, and we have other amazing presentations. So do join us, and join us obviously for Bahkmut, and when we schedule it, hopefully in 2 weeks. Thank you guys. Bye. And thank you
Guys, this was great.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yep. Thanks.
Good
All right,
afternoon,
bye.
everybody. Thank
You too.